Thank you, Presiding Officer. Stage 1 debate is generally a debate on principles of the bill, and while the annual budget bill is slightly different, we should still be able to have an open debate about priorities and the strategic direction that the Government plan on taking the country with their budget. But, Presiding Officer, that's been almost impossible. The smoke and mirrors, the political spin, and at points verging on dishonest presentation of the figures and their impact means that we can't have that debate with Government because the response is just to deny reality. The Scottish Government talk in the same breath of the changes to their budgets in real terms, but then the changes to local government's budget in cash terms. The Government talk about increases to local government budgets, but don't bother to mention that the extra funding is already set aside for new commitments. And we see that so-called extra funding trick. Yeah, certainly.
Stephen Kerr.
My concern that in the way that the Deputy First Minister handled my intervention on him about the £100 million, my concern that that £100 million will not be additional to the current budget for education in our local authorities because of the situation he's outlining.
Mark Griffin.
Yeah. Absolutely. The Government asked us to come to the table and have an honest discussion about where we would cut, where we would spend additional funding. But until we have the transparency, that honest starting point, that is impossible for anyone in this party without the support of Government and civil servants. But we've seen that on year, the Government announced extra funding for new government, a so-called extra funding trick. They announced with fanfare a new welcome policy. I give an example, 1140 nursery hours, and a warmly welcome policy, hugely important in terms of getting working parents back into the economy, supporting kids with extra early learning and childcare. But the funding is announced, it's allocated in year 1, then it's combined with the general grant, and it never gets uprated with inflation. So the Government gets the plaudits, and the Council is left needing to squeeze other areas of budget to maintain that commitment, or else what we've seen recently is they're threatened with legislation to keep it going. And it's not good enough for Government to come to this chamber and talk about shared priorities, shared commitments. If they're shared commitments, then there surely must be a shared commitment to pay for the increase in cost year on year, rather than leaving that burden with local government. And we can't have an honest debate with the Government when it comes to ring-fencing, when Government maintains that ring-fenced funds for local authorities amount to just 7%, relying on a strict legal argument when there are billions more in directed spending that councils have no control over. And the recent announcement of legislation from the Government in response to Glasgow considering cutting their teacher numbers shows that 7% figure was always just spin. And when we consider the impact on councils of that announcement, what then does that say to other council staff? That the Government only care about teachers, that teachers are the only jobs in local government worth protecting. Now, my 5-year-old daughter can tell you that the janitor, the catering staff, the cleansing staff, the bus driver, the school crossing patroller, they're just as much a part of her education as teachers, but they're not worth protecting because this Government only seems to value teachers when it comes to education, and now all those extra staff that do just as much work just as hard to support my daughter's education will take a bigger hit as a result of this budget, and I'm sure they'll hear the message of the Government's priorities loud and clear. The Government also talked about the huge cuts to the housing budget, appalling in the year when we've just seen the highest ever recorded homelessness figures since they've been recorded. They talk about that huge cut as just reprofiling of the £3.5 billion they plan to spend anyway. But, Presiding Officer, that has taken us and the public for absolute fools. When inflation is at the highest it's been for years, when inflation in the construction industry was already running out of control before general inflation caught up, it's clear that spending the bulk of that funding further down the line means that it will be worth less. Fewer houses will be built, fewer people who are experiencing homelessness will find a home, and it's all just because the Government want to pretend a budget cut isn't a cut. Shelter and Spice tell us it's a cut. Government say it's reprofiling. I know who I'll be listening to. And when he announced his budget, the Cabinet Secretary, I asked them, what are the costs to the health service of raiding budgets? What happens when people can't access a local authority's preventative services because they simply no longer exist because of cuts? I've not had an answer. Councils haven't had an answer. What does that do to our NHS? Because, Presiding Officer, all of this amounts to cuts, and someone will have to pay the bill. Given the preventative nature of spending in communities and housing, we know that. We know it will be the NHS and ordinary people that will pay that price. Thank you.